Autism or Narcissism? Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. You may have watched my interview a little while ago with Harry, who is known as the Naughty Autie, and we had a discussion about narcissism generally, but also the perspectives of somebody who is autistic, as Harry is. It was a very useful, wide-ranging and expansive discussion. This has led, of course, alongside the standard questions that I receive from people who want to understand more about the differences between autism and narcissism, because, of course, there are some similar manifestations of behaviour. The starting point, of course, is to consider what is narcissism. Quite simply, narcissism is a self-defense mechanism that originates as a consequence of having a genetic predisposition allied to a lack of control environment, and the narcissism forms as a defense mechanism to protect that individual. It results in a hypersensitivity to threats to control, a near constant need for control over other people, a hypervigilance towards assessing whether a person is or is not under control, the necessity to receive fuel by way of validation to continue to maintain the construct, which is the false self, a need to obtain character traits which form the construct and allow the assertion of control and the drawing of fuel, and, of course, the residual benefits, which is a whole raft of matters that the narcissist needs, which again can then be utilised for the twin main purposes of fuel and control. Narcissism, of course, has its diagnosis in the DSM with regard to the relevant criteria there. And one looks for behaviours which exhibit a sense of entitlement, an absence of emotional empathy, a lack of accountability for behaviours, grandiosity, haughtiness, magical thinking, manipulative behaviours, boundary recognition issues, and, of course, various aspects of the narcissistic dynamic. The existing diagnosis that we have is rather narrow, and, as you know from my work, there are a wide range of different narcissists, some more easy to spot than others. And it's utilising the criteria that I have just mentioned that enables one, by adhering to a strict evidential threshold, and should that individual get over that strict evidential threshold with regard to a number of those criteria, they are then demonstrably a narcissist. There are, of course, people who are narcissistic but are not narcissists. Narcissism is a pathological behaviour. It's entrenched. It forms part of who that individual is and cannot be removed. A narcissist cannot heal. Certain unaware narcissists believe that they have healed. That is just part of their continued manipulation of people, often causing them to create YouTube channels whereby they declare that they have conquered their narcissism or they're busy working on it. But actually they're not. Their narcissism is working them, and they're unaware that that is what is going on. Others of my kind, such as myself, were aware, harness our narcissism and recognise that it is part of what we are, and that we're not going to change, and nor do we want to change, even where possible, because we're entirely effective as we are. Narcissism, of course, is capable of causing huge problems for people, particularly with regard to interpersonal relationships, notably those of a romantic and familial type, but also in work and social environments also. Narcissists, of course, can be highly driven to achieve, creating fantastic works of art, novels, screenplays, companies, entrepreneurial ideas, innovations, and so forth. But there are always a cost that is associated with an entanglement with the narcissist, and therefore the ability to identify whether you're dealing with a narcissist or not is hugely important. What about autism? Well, autism operates essentially as known as being on spectrum, and it's a range of neurodevelopment conditions which are characterized primarily by a wide range of difficulties in social interactions, differences in communication, and presentations of rigid and repetitive behavior. Of course, some of those aspects may well be seen in the behavior of a narcissist, particularly with regard to difficulties in social interactions. The autism spectrum is a range of unusual responses to sensory input, including high or low sensitivity, sensory discrimination, and sensory-based motor differences are also highly prevalent. It's commonly referred to as autism and officially designated Autism Spectrum disorder. A spectrum disorder is one that can manifest very differently from person to person. Any given person is likely to show some but not all of the characteristics associated with it, and may show them to very different degrees. Again, that has similarities with narcissism, whereby there are certain core behaviours that are always present with every single narcissist, but then there are a number of variations, which of course make it more difficult for people to determine what they're dealing with. Different autistic people might show strikingly different characteristics, and the same person may also present differently at different times. Again, a narcissist, of course, can present differently, for instance, the way that they behave behind closed doors compared to the operation of facade more generally. The autism spectrum was historically divided into subcategories, but there were persistent questions over the validity of these divisions, and the most recent editions of the major English language diagnostic manuals, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, both lists ASD as a single disorder. There is, of course, some dispute over the appropriateness of the term disorder, and many sources prefer to use autism rather than ASD. While psychiatry traditionally classifies autism as a neurodevelopment disorder, certain advocates see autism as part of neurodiversity, the natural diversity in human thinking and experience. On this view, promoted by the autism rights movement, there is not necessarily anything wrong with an autistic person, but this does not preclude them being disabled and potentially having high support needs. This relatively positive view of autism has led to a certain degree of friction between autistic individuals, advocates, and charities. Other controversies in autism are scientific, political, or philosophical. Scientists are still trying to determine what actually causes autism. It's highly heritable and believed to be mainly genetic, which, of course, does show a difference with regard to what causes narcissism. However, there are many genes involved in autism, and environmental factors may also be relevant. There are, it would appear, certain crossovers with regard to autism and narcissism. For instance, one was with regard to the position of empathy and how that's manifested. Because those with autism may experience difficulties in forming relationships with people and having reduced interest in other people and being more interested in objects, they may well be mistaken for a narcissist. Common signs for autistic spectrum disorder at an early age include little or no infant babbling, not pointing to show interest, or not showing interest when something is indicated, limited language skills, having reduced interest in other children or carers, and having a greater interest in objects, having trouble understanding others' feelings or talking about their own feelings, having difficulties in showing interest in others, showing interest in other people but not knowing how to play with them or relate to them, avoiding eye contact, wanting to be alone, increased sensitivity to the smell, texture, sound, taste, or appearance of things, being upset by changes in routine, possibly with trouble adapting to the changes, avoiding hugs except when they want them, difficulty expressing needs using verbal speech or gestures, and there are more. But, as you will note from some of those aspects, for instance, avoiding eye contact, that might be something that certain narcissists would do as part of a manipulation. The desire to want to be alone could be interpreted as essentially giving a silent treatment. Avoiding hugs may well be seen as a rejection of intimacy. Being upset by changes in routine quite possibly could be seen as viewed as a threat to control. So it's not difficult to see where there are many instances where autism and narcissism could present as being fairly similar, and thus causing a difficulty with regard to people in making a determination. However, what I'm going to do in a further part of this series is explain to you the distinctions between autism and narcissism along with the similarities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take behaviours which are similar, but then point out the differences to aid you in understanding how you can make those differentiations. I will identify the relevant characteristics and behaviours of both instances and show how there are differences in terms of the driver behind the action and also the way that it manifests, so that you are able to see clearly these differences to help you make the distinction between autism and narcissism. This will prove extremely important, not only for those who are autistic who might find themselves being accused of being a narcissist when they're not, but also more generally for those of you who may find yourself involved with someone who's autistic and believing them possibly to be narcissist instead. Much of it turns on social cues, imitation, empathy, and the ability to understand and decode the intention of others. And by comparing those factors and others with regard to somebody with autism and somebody with narcissism, I'm going to provide you with a detailed walkthrough so that you can see the differences and it will increase your understanding. Look out for the next section of this series coming very soon indeed. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.